Ich wollte gerade ein Video machen und ich wurde angeschrieben von einer Frau und das passiert nicht häufig. Seitdem ich Single bin, lassen wir das. Vergessen wir das. Übrigens auf dem Kanal, ich weiß das noch von früher, ich habe Witze darüber gemacht. Wir haben eine geringere Frauenquote als Pornhub. Also ich wette, falls eine Frau auch nur dieses Video sieht, schreibt mir das bitte in die Kommentare. Ansonsten starten wir mit dem Video. Ich habe mir überlegt, ich mache eine Reaction mit euch und ich habe ein Video gesehen, wo ich dachte, okay, das würde mich zumindest interessieren, wenn wir Kampfsport-Content wollen. Und das ist 10 Momente, die dazu geführt haben, dass sofort die MMA-Regeln geändert werden mussten. Das heißt, es muss irgendwas gewesen sein, wo man gesagt hat, okay, wir müssen unbedingt die Regeln ändern. Okay, starten wir in das Video.
One of the biggest misconceptions about MMA is that it has very few rules. Depending on how your hands are placed on the ground, you can't use certain maneuvers.
Ganz kurz, ne? Also Sie sagen das jetzt auf Englisch, ich werde das kurz übersetzen, dass eines der größten Irrglauben, die es gibt, dass es wenig Regeln gibt. Und ich sehe das komplett genauso. Ich weiß noch, als ich damals groß wurde und Freunde von mir das erste Mal kämpfen, dann gab es Regeln, das waren die ganzen, ich weiß noch, das hieß glaube ich OC Plus, OC Minus, also war so, als MMA in Deutschland eingeführt wurde, da gab es noch keinen Namen dafür. Das ist der Hauptgrund, warum da, wo ich dann damals trainierte, die nannten sich Valetudo. Und es gab halt wirklich überhaupt keine Regeln. Dann wurde sich vor dem Kampf geeinigt noch, hat mir ein Freund erzählt, okay, wir beißen uns jetzt nicht, aber das war auch schon so, okay, das war schon so das Hauptelement der Regeln. Wann war das? Wie alt bin ich? Es muss so 2006 gewesen sein.
Maneuvers, you can't elbow at particular angles. Apparently, if you have a boob job, that creates a bit of an issue with getting past health regulations. I don't know. And the more and more you dive into it, the more mindless minutia there is in the rule set. And so this misconception that there are so few rules stems back to the old days more than it does anything else. Ball punches, fish hooking, hair pulling, punches to the back of the head.
Damals war das alles erlaubt. Ich habe das ja auch manchmal eingeblendet. Es gibt eine unheimlich coole Reportage auf YouTube von Mark Kerr. Guckt euch das unbedingt an, wo er erzählt, okay, pass auf, eigentlich bin ich so ein freundlicher Typ, aber wenn ich dann verliere, dann stellt sich so die Frage, drücke ich dem Gegner den Finger in die Augen? Er sagt, ja. No, deswegen, also, das schon damals, jetzt, Sie sagen gerade hier, ne, jetzt, es wurden dann eingeführt, Haare ziehen, in die Augen stechen, der Hoden. Das war nicht immer verboten.
Head, knees on the ground, etc. used to all be legal, which for obvious reasons all became illegal.
Er sagt ja, durch offensichtliche Gründe wurde es illegal.
Also a lot of crazy rules that basically had to come about because somebody actually tried to do it. So that's what we'll get into today. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and these are the top 10 houses sold by Ally Quinta.
Finally.
Number 10, the Mac Mansion. I don't know what just happened there. My bad. These are 10 precise fight moments that forever changed MMA rules. Number 10, Vaseline Gate.
Okay, Vaseline Gate, ja, das bestimmt, dass ihr euch nicht einschmieren dürft. Das stelle ich mir richtig lustig vor, wie jemand sich halt richtig, es ist ja immer im Grappling vor allem, oder wenn wir von MMA reden, und stimmt, es wird bestimmt keine Regeln gegeben haben am Anfang. Und dann werden da so glitschige Leute einfach. Stell dir das vor, so.
Okay. Prior to almost all fights in any combat sport, you can usually see a cut man applying Vaseline to a fighter's face, which also gets topped up in between rounds. And basically the reason why is Vaseline reduces the chance of skin getting cut and minimizes the friction of incoming shots. Because obviously it's not ideal to have a fight stopped just because of a cut. But until UFC 94, a fighter's cornerman was allowed to apply this at the end of each round. And if you've ever felt Vaseline or petroleum jelly more generically, you'll know it's extremely slippery. So when George St. Pierre's corner began illegally rubbing the substance on his shoulders, chest, and back during his welterweight title defense at UFC 94,
ach krass, George St. Pierre hat das gemacht.
Reasonably arose. Now, nobody knows if this was an honest mistake or genuine attempt to cheat, since it was...
Also wenn das nicht verboten war, ist das ja kein Cheaten. Aber krass, also könnt ihr euch das vorstellen? Das sagen Sie jetzt gerade, ne? Das, was ich sage, eigentlich kluger Schachzug. Das ist übrigens das, was ich gehört habe bei Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss sagt, er hat nie Kickboxen gemacht, aber er hat sich damals die Regeln angeguckt und hat geguckt, wo Lücken sind. Und so hat er damals ein Kickbox-Turnier gewonnen. Einfach weil der Gegner dreimal, er hat die Regeln gelesen und hat gesagt, okay, ich habe gelesen, die Gegner dürfen nicht von der Matte gehen. Und dann ist er einfach auf sie zugerannt und hat sie von der Matte geworfen. Und er hat das Kickbox-Turnier so gewonnen. By the way, ziemlich dumme Regel, aber fand ich interessant.
such an incredibly small amount, but his opponent that night, BJ Penn, was furious, and even Dana White had a brief octagon side rant. As a result of the hubbub, right then and there, GSP was toweled down at the beginning of the rounds 3 and 4 by members of the commission, so the Vaseline issue was only in play during the second rounds. But this was an extremely glaring flaw ripe for abuse, and with the extremely vocal protest of BJ Penn's camp and Dana's feelings about that kind of thing, the UFC instituted a permanent rule along with the athletic commissions that employed independent cutmen to exclusively apply Vaseline moving forward to the fighters. Number 9. No more Speedos. There's not
Was sind Speedos?
many sports that have a bigger disparity in male to female fans than MMA. Our own channel's metrics reflect that pretty starkly.
We're the fucking females.
Ja, was habe ich gesagt? Was habe ich gesagt?
That's basically why we have ring girls and not Magic Mike types parading around the cage, unless of course you're an Invicta. But at UFC 133, Dennis Hallman didn't only fight inside the octagon, but he also ended up showing more skin than your favorite ring girl. In his TKO loss to Brian Ebersol, who already made things weird by having an arrow shaved right into his chest, Hallman wore an extremely small pair of blue trunks, claiming to have lost a bet with his teammates.
Ich werde keine Geschichte dazu
Kind of thing,
erzählen.
but a bet's a bet, and you gotta stand up for what you bet.
Regardless, Dana White was outraged in the aftermath, saying that he was horrified at what he saw.
I'd call it disgusting. That was disgusting.
Das wird doch bestimmt. Ich verstehe gar nicht, warum sie das verboten haben.
No one would ever fight in the UFC again looking like that.
It will never happen again. I can guarantee you that.
Thank you, Dana. For his next fight, Hallman would go on to pick up a submission win, but his contract was never renewed by the UFC. And although Dana claims this wasn't
Das finde ich, ich bin doch froh, dass er eine Hose anhatte.
due to the clothing fiasco, not that many people are released on winning streaks. And to this day, if you type in Dennis Hallman on Google, Speedo and shorts are usually the first suggestions that show up with your results. The legend lives on. Number 8, 12 to 6 elbows. This is perhaps the silliest rule that fans want changed.
Ich weiß, dass das inzwischen verboten ist, aber ich kann keine Geschichte. Also ihr dürft 12 to 6, ihr dürft von oben nach unten keine Elbows machen. Ich habe das, jetzt wo wir bei DFC sind gerade, da wurde das auch gesagt. Okay, keine 12 to 6 Elbows in irgendeinem Kampf.
Changed the most, especially if your name is John Jones. The most common reason why this straight up and straight down elbow is banned is because athletic commissions were afraid based on seeing martial arts demonstrations where they would break like a whole foot of ice or something dumb like that. Boards that were weakened ahead of time, you know, that kind of thing. While true that this is a factor, that's actually only part
Das wäre ja eine richtig dumme Regel.
of the reason. While speaking on the Joe Rogan podcast, Big John McCarthy, who was there when the first official unified rule
Also habt ihr es gehört? Sie sagen jetzt gerade, ein Teil der Gründe, warum das verboten ist, weil man das aus Karatefilmen oder diesen Demonstrationen kennt, wo diese voll trotteligen Blöcke
of
zerstören.
mixed martial arts were created, explained that this technique was banned also due to one single fight. In the year 2000, 6'10" Gan McGee faced a much smaller foe in Brad Gabriel at IFC Battleground 2. Unfortunately, we couldn't find footage of this online. It's probably in somebody's VHS player, or maybe dubbed over. The giant McGee, who would later go on to challenge for the UFC heavyweight title, blasted his opponent with these downward elbows repeatedly, and it was one of the doctors at this event who would assist John McCarthy in creating the unified rules. The doctor wanted to ban all elbows at first, but settled on just banning the 12 to 6 downward
Aber das finde ich wieder. Also das ist ja eine dumme Regel, die dann da eingeführt wurde.
elbow because of John McCarthy. He cited this fight as the major reason why. Number 7, throwing an opponent over the cage. Despite the fact that there weren't many rules in Tank
Ich darf keinen Gegner über den Zaun werfen. Ne?
Abbott's day, you already know he's the type of guy who wouldn't follow the rules even in modern MMA, if he felt he could get away with it.
Hey,
And his intentions
süßes
during
Lächeln.
his fight with Cal Worsham at Ultimate in 1996 led to an instant rule being created that many fans may not have even thought about. Immediately as the fight started, Abbott, who had a walkout stat that he benched over 600 pounds, rushed forward in his typical brawling manner, but then surprisingly picked up the 230-pound Cal Worsham and literally tried throwing his opponent over the octagon like it's dead or alive and ring outs are an automatic win or something. The
Aus
worrying
welchem-
thing was Tank Abbott actually came pretty close, with Worsham explaining that only his heel and the padding saved him from the embarrassment. In the end, Tank comfortably got the victory, but obviously the potential for a fighter to fall 6 foot head
Das ist doch
first
richtig
onto a metal
unnütz.
platform needed to be removed. Big John McCarthy soon after made the ruling within the UFC to disqualify anyone who tried to throw their opponent over the
Was für eine geile Regel. Aber erstmal krass, dass John McCarthy all die Regeln anscheinend erstellt.
side of the cage, which also led to the realization that fence grabbing should probably also be banned. Number 6, short grabbing. In MMA today, there's minimal excess clothing, and for good reason. Fighter shorts don't get in the way by constantly getting disheveled or untucked like they did with the old gis, and still do in full gi BJJ competitions today. But in the case of Pat Miletich versus Mikey Burnett for the inaugural welterweight title back in 1998,
Die haben aber keine Hosen, die man eigentlich richtig anfassen kann, ne? Bin ich mal gespannt. Also jetzt, die Hosen dürfen nicht mehr gegrabt werden.
both men's shorts somehow became a pivotal aspect of the fight. Throughout the entire contest, both Miletich and Burnett had a solid grasp of each other's shorts, which resulted in one very dull affair.
Ja, die haben aber einen langweiligen Kampf gemacht. Ja, das finde ich ist eine gute Regel. Wobei,
The
ja,
fighter could break away and begin striking very often. Not only did it make for an obviously uneventful inaugural title fight to take place, but also the crowd found the whole ordeal pretty comical. John McCarthy had the unenviable task of having to fix Burnett's shorts and getting dangerously close to his junk in the process, while fans had a great view of Miletich's right butt cheek. What the fuck, man? So, short grabbing became instantly banned and fighters were legally unable to use them for leverage, again for obvious reasons. Pat's shorts were coincidentally the first UFC shorts with the infamous tap out logo on them and were sold on eBay for over $1,500 in 2015. I'm sure they smell
$1,500. $1,500 nur, also
really great. Number 5, the introduction
ja nicht so lecker,
of
aber
TKOs. In the very first iteration of the UFC, fights were only ended in one of 3 ways: knockout, submission, or by cornermen throwing in the towel. But even these minimal rules weren't abided by at the inaugural UFC event when Gerard Gordeau landed a massive head kick to the sumo fighter Taylor Tuli and sent his tooth soaring into the front row. That's because the original referee understandably recognized
Alter Schwede, hat er ihn gekickt und hat ihm die Zähne.
the danger and stopped the fight. UFC founder Rorion Gracie was extremely upset because he didn't want stoppages back then at all. Basically, the loser is out completely cold, or they somehow quit through themselves or their team. So Rorion asked his friend Big John McCarthy to referee from there on out and follow this rule completely blindly, unlike the first referees did. Enter UFC 2, where Pat Smith delivered some hellacious elbows to Scott Morris from the mount.
Das ist ein krasser Kämpfer. Also hört ihr, der Kämpfer wollte nicht, also Gracie, jeder von euch wird ihn kennen, der sich damit beschäftigt hat, aber Gracie wollte nicht, dass auf jeden Fall der Kampf abgebrochen wird und hat deswegen seinen eigenen Ringrichter
But due
geholt.
to the rules, McCarthy was totally unable to stop the fight. And it appears that Big John shouting at Morris's corner and Pat Smith hearing that, deciding to get up, or him just deciding that it was done, meant that the brutal onslaught was over. You can only imagine if he just didn't stop. And so after the event in this particular moment, McCarthy threatened to Rorion that he would quit if not given the power to protect fighters. So starting at UFC 3, the concept of referee stoppages were born. Number 4,
Ah. Aber das ist eine gute Regel
groin
eigentlich.
shots. Inspired by the UFC, the International
Tritt in die Hoden. Bin ich mal gespannt, wie es dazu kam, dass das verboten wurde.
Championship, or IVC for short, held their first event in 1997. It was a one-night tournament in which former UFC fighter Gary Big Daddy Goodridge fought lucha libre expert Pedro Octavio in the finals. Eye gouging and biting were illegal, but groin shots were given the green light by the Brazilian organization, to which Goodridge obliged, striking right at his opponent's first possession, but would even go further than just kneeing Octavio's balls, digging his feet and toes literally into Pedro's trunks to try to escape being on the bottom. When the two were standing, Goodridge got even more uncomfortably intimate with his opponent, getting a handful of his junk that forced Pedro to fall to the ground in discomfort. And yeah, all this led to
Gut, dass sie die Regel
Goodridge securing the stoppage victory. The IVC thankfully would create a specific rule banning a fighter from reaching into their opponent's
Der Arme, so verliert man.
trunks for the following event. The most infamous and justified ball smashing occurred at UFC 4 between convicted gang rapist and murderer Joe Sun by Keith Hackney. But this alone wasn't enough to force an immediate rule change, as this took place a whole 3 years later before the promotion would ban it in 1997, which coincidentally coincidentally was a few months after the IVC banned it, but for totally different reasons, with mounting political pressure being the biggest reason of all. Number 3. Lay and pray. After their first fight at UFC 1, both Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock won various tournaments and titles before their rematch. The UFC's first poster boy Gracie won the UFC 2 and 4 tournaments,
Ich frage mich, was sie da
while
verboten haben.
Shamrock went and conquered Pancrase, picking up the inaugural title in Japan. So obviously there was a significant amount of hype when the two rematched at UFC 5, with fans hoping to see how Ken could tackle Royce's submission game at the second attempt. But instead of the interesting grappling affair everyone had hoped for, we witnessed a whole load of inactivity, with Shamrock laying tight in Gracie's guard, just avoiding submissions
Dass sie abbrechen, wenn es zu langweilig ist, ja?
mostly, and barely taking the risk to land much ground and pound of his own. With there being no ruling to stand up the fighters for lack of action back then, Shamrock essentially just laid there defensively and was afraid to risk anything on top of Royce Gracie for 36 whole minutes.
Das ist der wirklich langweiligste Kampf der Welt. 36 Minuten, weil sie Angst hatten, irgendwas zu machen.
Until the fight was declared a draw, which marked the longest bout in UFC history and the first draw in the promotion ever. In order to combat this, the referees were immediately given the ability to stand up fighters for inactivity for the following event, which definitely was a great addition to the rule set. Unfortunately, this means we've seen many questionable stand-ups since then, but at least it does prevent something like this from happening. On top of this, overtime limits were formally adopted, in part to avoid number 2, the introduction of judges. The old UFC brass definitely hated the idea of having to bring in judges. They hoped that they had addressed the issue of inactivity with ref stand-ups and overtimes, therefore preventing subsequent draws. After all, aside from Ken vs. Royce 2, 68 of the first 69 UFC fights all ended with
68 of the first 69, also 36.
Problem solved, right? Well, not entirely, as Ken Shamrock met Oleg Taktarov at UFC 7 with Ken's super fight title on the line, but standing both men up and asking for action didn't lead to a finish. Despite Shamrock being the aggressor, the bout lacked much activity at all, and a stoppage was never close throughout the 33 minutes. Ken claimed in his autobiography that he didn't want to inflict too much damage on Oleg, who would train with the Lion's Den, but he was also known for training people ruthlessly back then with a coaching style of just beating everyone up. So, sure. He also said having shoes at UFC 1 would have meant he would beat Royce Gracie.
They took away my shoes because they knew that if they could take away my balance, that Royce would have a better chance of beating me. Just my opinion, they cheated.
But nevertheless, without any actual judges in place octagon side to score the fight, yet another big main event in the UFC ended in a draw and therefore a massive failure. In response, the next event was the first in UFC history to feature judges' scorecards and decisions along with a 15-minute time
Ja, aber bei der UFC ist so, eigentlich feiere ich deren Regeln.
element in an effort to push the action further. Ironically though, during the tournament, both semifinals and the final would all go to a decision. Number 1 championships weight cutting. I think most of us can easily agree that weight cutting is probably the most
Krass, okay.
ridiculous aspect of this sport. Nearly all fighters undergo a
Boah, guckt euch mal an, wie Conor damals noch aussah. Das ist so krass, ne?
gruesome dehydration process just in order to not be the smaller man with a weight disadvantage a day later at fight night. In December of 2015, 21-year-old Chinese flyweight Yang Jianbing tragically paid the ultimate price for this
Krass, starb durch Dehydration.
insanity and died after attempting a particularly difficult weight cut. It's extremely disappointing that it took a death in order for the ruling to change, but one championship made a drastic overhaul to their weight cutting protocols as a direct result.
Ist das bei der UFC auch so? Gibt es da Regeln? Weil ich weiß ja auch, wie war das nochmal? Khabib kam, glaube ich, ins Krankenhaus, ne? Weil der so krass Weight gecuttet hat. Das war ja auch vor dem Kampf gegen Gaethje, dass alle gesagt haben, der sieht nicht gut aus, der ist so, und er hat ja auch, ich glaube, gebetet, dass er das Gewicht geschafft hat, ne?
And utilized hydration tests to essentially eradicate weight cuts altogether. But there are tons of questions of this still, as many fighters look noticeably big on fight night. There are examples like Eddie Alvarez, where even though lightweight is at 170 pounds in one instead of 155, his walking around weight has been claimed to be as high as 190 in the past. You shouldn't be able to get past hydration tests if you're that heavy. He's also stated that his opponents are bigger than him in one. DJ has said the same about his opponents. For Angela Lee, it's in the reverse at atom weight, where she looked.
Ja, das ist halt so eine Sache, durch diese Gewichtsklassen, ne, gehen halt Leute dahin, das zu machen, finde ich, ja, schwer zu sagen, ne? Das ist so halt ein Riesenaspekt. Und beim Boxen zum Beispiel, ne? Also wenn wir das im Amateurboxen haben, ihr am selben Tag gewogen werdet, könnt ihr nicht so krass viel Gewicht machen, dann seid ihr schwächer. Im MMA aber könnt ihr 10, 15 Kilo Gewicht machen und am nächsten Tag fühlt ihr euch, wenn ihr euch gut dehydriert, eventuell Medikamente nehmt oder so. Schon eine Sache. Also finde ich gut, dass sie da Regeln eingeführt haben, aber bei der UFC glaube ich nicht, oder?
In the last month or so, they finally started posting video of the weigh-ins, even though folks like Angela Lee are still showing up needing to use a hoop, which is indicative of a weight cut. Of course, it's still possible if she's trying to stay within hydration limits and just needs that last little bit in the article of clothing to shave it off. It just requires a bit of healthy skepticism. Because if it works properly, it should definitely be brought to MMA around the world if it can do what it claims. But the death associated with this rule automatically makes it top our list and certainly is the most important change to make before it happens under the unified rules.
Ja, krass. Also krass. Seht ihr? Unglaublich, was da mit den Regeln ist. Geiles Video. Ich weiß nicht, ob jemand von euch Englisch versteht, ne? Das ist so das Problem. Könnt ihr alle Englisch? Ansonsten aber hoffe ich, dass euch das gefallen hat, Leute. Danke fürs Zuhören und wir hören uns beim nächsten Mal.